Well, hello and welcome to another Sunday Coffee with Dr. Childress here. Now, today I'm going to be discussing my entry into the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, the AFCC, the professional organization for legal professionals and mental health professionals in the family courts. And as I enter the AFCC, I'm a member. I've joined, and I'm a member now of the Washington, Oregon, and California chapters. And I will be participating with the other court-involved professionals. And as I'm encountering the forensic psychologists in the AFCC, I have concerns. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today is what those concerns are, and we'll begin moving towards a resolution of those concerns. So starting with just some terminology here. The definition, if you Google the definition of the word ignorance, it is the lack of knowledge or information. So let me just say something about that for a second, because when I use the word ignorant or ignorance, it is a descriptive term about their professional knowledge. There can be knowledgeable about plumbing or, fly fishing or something. They can be knowledgeable about a lot of things, but relative to the professional information, they lack knowledge or information, so that would make them ignorant about what the pathology actually is, requiring them to then make up these new forms of pathology for things they do not otherwise comprehend. So I want to clarify just that term there. And that if a doctor needs to be educated about the pathology, then that doctor is ignorant. They lack knowledge or information by definition of the English language. The patient should never need to educate the doctor about the pathology, what it is and how it's diagnosed and treated. The doctor should already know what the pathology is, and it's the doctor who should educate the patient about what the pathology is. In addition, if I need to educate the doctors to have a professional level discussion of the pathology with them, then that doctor is ignorant. They lack knowledge or information by definition of the English language. And we shouldn't have ignorant doctors. An ignorant doctor is not a competent doctor. So I should not have to educate them to have a discussion about their patient. In addition, some additional terminology. If you Google lazy, they're unwilling to work or use energy. Now, perhaps a better term might be indolence. It's a little fancier, less direct, but that's the avoidance of activity or exertion. Laziness. Okay, so if they are unwilling to exert the effort necessary to learn the necessary knowledge, attachment, family systems, delusional thought disorders, all the necessary knowledge, personality disorders, DSM-5, then they are lazy by definition of the English language, or indolent by definition of the English language. So the forensic psychologists in the family courts are ignorant, lack knowledge and information. I'm going to have to educate them about what the pathology is. And they're lazy. They haven't taken it upon themselves to learn the necessary information. They're unwilling to work or use energy and give themselves permission just to make up new forms of pathology for things they do not otherwise comprehend. So as I enter the AFCC, I am encountering the ignorant, lack of knowledge or information, and lazy, avoid effort forensic psychologists. So as I came in, they had this course. The AFCC offered a course in advanced issues in family law, parent-child contact problems. So as a member of the AFCC, I took the course on advanced issues in family law taught by 6 of their prominent forensic psychologists: Dr. Deutsch, Dr. Droids, Dr. Moran, Dr. Klein Pruitt, Dr. Sullivan, and Dr. Ward. Okay, so I took that course and developed concerns based on the content and curriculum of that course. In addition, the Washington chapter recently had their conference, their Washington State Conference. I'm a member of the Washington chapter. I live in Washington State. It was in Seattle. I'm right across a little waterway from them. And so I went, and it was a talk or course or training by Dr. Fiddler and Dr. Droids. So I have now encountered a set of their top forensic psychologists in the family courts that are presenting education to other psychologists, to other mental health professionals, to attorneys, and they're talking about what the pathology is, the attachment pathology, what they're calling parent-child contact problems or resist-refuse dynamic attachment problems. So they're discussing that and educating, supposedly, the attorneys and other mental health professionals and other legal professionals about what the attachment pathology is that they're calling this new form of pathology. So, based on the course curriculums and content, I believe there may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist, a collective group of psychologists. I'm concerned primarily about 3 ethical standards. Standard 2.04, Bases for Scientific and Professional Judgments. Standard 2.01, Boundaries of Competence. And Standard 3.04, Avoiding Harm. So starting with Standard 2.04, Bases for Scientific and Professional Judgments. That it says, psychologists' work is based upon the established scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline. The established professional knowledge is the DSM-5 and ICD-11 diagnostic systems, attachment and all the attachment research, child abuse and complex trauma and all that research, family systems, and personality disorder pathology. So that's the established knowledge that is required to be applied. Now, let me say something about that too, which is you're required to apply that knowledge before making up new forms of pathology. Okay, if you want to propose a new form of pathology like parental alienation or resist-refuse dynamic or parent-child contact problems that doesn't exist anywhere else in society, and you're thinking that you've discovered this new pathology unique to the family courts and you want to propose that, that's fine. Do it after you apply the established knowledge. Start with the DSM-5. Apply the DSM-5. If you still need a new pathology proposal after doing that, make your proposal. But if you apply the DSM-5, you're going to find out the pathology is already fully explained within the DSM-5, within attachment, within complex trauma, within family systems. It's already fully explained. You're just ignorant, lack knowledge or information about the established knowledge, so therefore you don't know what the pathology is, and you have to make up new things for symptoms you do not otherwise comprehend. So there is no new pathology unique to the family courts that requires its own unique new diagnostic label. If a pathology exists in the family courts, it exists in the general population and is only being triggered into activation by the divorce and the features of the divorce. And clearly we have rejection, which is a narcissistic vulnerability that's going to trigger a narcissistic dark triad or dark tetrad personality. And we have potentially the triggering of abandonment fears, which is a borderline vulnerability and vulnerable dark triad. So we're going to be seeing active, narcissistic, borderline, and dark triad, vulnerable dark triad parents activating into manipulation, high conflict divorce, and into their pathology. The reliance on made-up pathology labels instead of the application of established knowledge, DSM-5, ICD-11, indicates the psychologist lacks knowledge or information, is ignorant about real forms of pathology, such as delusional thought disorders, persecutory delusion, factitious disorders imposed on another for secondary gain, um, you know, just and child psychological abuse. That either one or both of those is child psychological abuse. If a doctor needs to be educated about the DSM-5 diagnosis for the pathology, then that is an ignorant, lacks knowledge or information doctor. And an ignorant doctor is not a competent doctor. And it's just lazy. There are reasons for Standard 2.04. There are reasons to require the application of established knowledge as the basis for professional judgments. So I would ask the forensic psychologists in the AFCC to take a moment and self-reflect a little bit. What bad things would happen if professionals simply made things up and did not apply the established scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline as the basis for their professional judgments? What bad things might happen off of that? Why is Standard 2.04 required, mandatory for all psychologists? Let's talk about 2.01. This is a more fundamental one because the reason they're not applying the knowledge is because they don't know the knowledge, and that's the violation of 2.01 boundaries of competence. What the APA says, required, mandatory, is that psychologists provide services, teach, and conduct research with populations and in areas only within the boundaries of their competence, based on their education, training, supervised experience, consultation, study, or professional experience. So the two concerns here, primary concerns, are for attachment pathology and that the forensic psychologists are not competent in the diagnostic assessment and treatment of attachment pathology in children based on their education, training, and experience. The second concern is that the forensic psychologists are not competent in the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders based on their education, training, and experience. And when the pathology is an attachment pathology, let me talk about that for a second. Child rejecting a parent or any sort of problem, mild, moderate, or severe in the parent-child bond is an attachment pathology. That's a problem in love and bonding. And so if you're not competent in the attachment system and attachment pathology, when you're working with attachment pathology, that's going to be problematic. That's going to cause harm to your patient clients because you're practicing beyond the boundaries of your competence with attachment pathology if you're treating attachment pathology. Secondly, the differential diagnosis is either for the attachment pathology, is either child abuse by the targeted parent creating the attachment pathology, child seeking to flee a parent, or potentially a persecutory delusion from the allied narcissistic borderline dark personality pathology who's creating this false pathology in the child for secondary gain to that parent. So the differential diagnosis is a persecutory delusion. So if you're not competent in the diagnostic assessment of persecutory thought disorders, then that's going to harm your clients because you're going to misdiagnose the persecutory delusion. And that's really bad with this pathology because if you misdiagnose a shared delusion and you believe the shared delusion is true, then you become part of the shared delusion. You become part of the pathology. And when that pathology is the psychological abuse of the child, you become part of the psychological child abuse because you have misdiagnosed the persecutory delusion and believe it's true when it's not, because you are practicing beyond the boundaries of your competence in the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders. Okay, so those are my concerns relative to standard 2.01. So now when I enter a picture, enter a matter, I will do a Vita review. I will look at the psychologist's Vita to see, relative to their competence in attachment pathology, where on the Vita of the forensic psychologist does it evidence their education, training, and experience with the diagnostic assessment and treatment of attachment pathology. In addition, I'm going to want to see where on their Vita of the forensic psychologist does it evidence their education, training, and experience with the diagnostic assessment and treatment of delusional thought disorders. So here's an example from Dr. Childress here. So on my Vita, this is what competence in attachment pathology would look like on a Vita. This is for my Vita. So my initial training, I received training in early childhood mental health, attachment pathology, from Dr. Marie Polson's early childhood program at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. And there's the two citations from my Vita on that, my pre-doctoral internship, postdoctoral fellowship, Children's Hospital. I worked on with the early childhood mental health rotation. Then I have additional diagnostic training. I am trained in 2 additional early childhood diagnostic systems, the DMIC, which is stronger in diagnosing autism spectrum pathology, and the DC0 to 3, which is stronger in diagnosing attachment pathology. And so there's the references, and those are on my Vita, so you can see I have additional diagnostic training regarding attachment pathology. In addition, I have treatment training. So I am trained in 2 early childhood attachment treatments, Watch, Wait, and Wonder, which is for infants, and Circle of Security for preschool-age children. And there are the citations on my Vita to that training in attachment therapies. In addition, I have infant mental health specialization, and infant mental health is the formation of the attachment system. That's where all the activity really takes place that first year, developing that attachment bond, and then into the first 5 years. And I am certified in parent-infant mental health, attachment pathology through Fielding Graduate Institute. And there's a citation to that on my Vita. Notice how hard I've worked to develop this competence, because I'm not lazy. I expend the effort necessary to acquire the knowledge I need to work with the population. Then additionally, I have clinical experience. So I served as the clinical director, senior staff, clinical director for a 3-university assessment and treatment center for children ages 0 to 5 in foster care. And Child Protective Services was our primary referral source. And there's the citation on my Vita to that. I mean, working foster care 0 to 5 is spot on working with attachment pathology. And I'm working at the upper levels of that as a clinical director. So that's what competence in attachment looks like on a Vita. That's what I'm looking for on the forensic psychologist Vita. Where is your competence, your training, your experience in attachment pathology, the diagnostic assessment and treatment of that? They don't have any of it. I'm looking at their Vitas, 0, and it's anticipated. You only get competence in attachment out of early childhood, and they've just been in the family courts. So now, relative to the delusional thought disorders, this is what competence in delusional thought disorders would look like. I received 12 years of annual training in the diagnostic and assessment of delusional thought disorders, a major UCLA NIMH study on schizophrenia. I was trained to 90% reliability, diagnostic reliability, with the co-directors of the diagnostic unit at the UCLA Brentwood VA and the authors of the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, one of the oldest, most widely used scales to measure psychotic symptoms, and Doctors Ventura and Lukoff. So 12 years of training, I know how to do the BPRS, and I'm very experienced in the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders, and there's the citation to that on my Vita. So there's reasons as well for standard 2.01. And there are reasons to require the doctor to be competent with the pathology they're working with. And so I would ask the forensic psychologists in the AFCC to self-reflect on what bad things would happen if the professionals were not competent in the diagnostic assessment of and treatment of the pathology they're working with. Okay. The third ethical concern I have is for avoiding harm. And that's the APA says psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their clients, patients, students, supervisees, research participants, organizational clients, and others with whom they work, and to minimize harm where it is foreseeable and unavoidable. So, rendering a professional level diagnosis, DSM-5, ICD-11, is a reasonable step for a doctor to take to avoid the foreseeable harm that could result from misdiagnosis if a professional level diagnosis is not made. If you do not apply the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5 and ICD-11 to your diagnostic formulations, your understanding of the cause of the problem, diagnosis, understanding the cause of the problem. If you don't apply the DSM-5, ICD-11 diagnostic criteria, the chances of misdiagnosis rise considerably, especially around a persecutory delusion and a false, factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child. If you don't examine for those psychiatric disorders using the diagnostic criteria, then the chances of misdiagnosis go up considerably. And if you misdiagnose a shared persecutory delusion, you become part of the shared delusion, you become part of the child abuse. And when it's also spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon, you become part of the spousal abuse because of your misdiagnosis, because you did not take the reasonable step of applying the DSM-5 diagnostic system to your assessment and diagnostic formulations for what's going on in the family. So I'm worried about 3.04, avoiding harm. Now, I have mandatory obligations under standard 1.04 and 1.05 when I believe there may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist. Well, based on the course curriculum and content that I've encountered within the AFCC, first on this advanced course on attachment pathology in the family courts, and then through the conference that they've had on my own chapter conference. Based on that content, I believe there may have been an ethical violation to standards 2.04, 2.01, and 3.04 of the APA Ethics Code by another psychologist, by a collective group of psychologists. My obligations under standard 1.04 and 1.05 of the APA Ethics Code are active based on my concerns for seeming violations to 2.04, 2.01, and 3.04. The ethical violations have caused substantial harm and will continue to cause substantial harm to a vulnerable population, the parents and children in the family courts. And so my obligations under 1.05 are also active. The forensic psychologists are conducting an experiment on human subjects regarding a new quasi-judicial role for doctors, using a new experimental assessment procedure called a forensic custody evaluations or parenting plan evaluation that they developed for their experimental new quasi-judicial role. The forensic psychology, first, two major problems so far, is that they have not informed the courts or the parents that the quasi-judicial role for doctors of informing the court on its custody decisions and this forensic custody evaluation procedure that they made up for that quasi-judicial role are experimental. Okay, so they're not informing the courts about that. They're not informing parents that it's an experiment, and they are not providing an alternative of the clinical diagnostic assessment, treatment as usual. And when they do their assessments, they do not diagnose and provide the court with information about the diagnosis. So the forensic psychologists are withholding diagnostic information from the litigant parents and the court. And let me say, I'm brought in often as a consultant for the targeted parent. And I am really, really concerned that the forensic psychologists are withholding diagnostic information from my client, the litigant parent, that they need to make their case to the court that a child protection response is needed. But they don't have that evidence that a child protection response is needed because they can't get a diagnosis from the forensic psychologists. The forensic psychologists are withholding diagnostic information from a litigant parent that they need to make their case. And I don't care what the opinions of the forensic psychologists are about diagnosis and we don't want to pathologize. I don't care what your opinions are. The litigant parent needs that diagnosis to press their case to the court that a child protection response is needed. And when you intentionally withhold diagnostic information from a litigant parent, you are influencing the court's decisions in favor of the pathological parent because you are hiding and covering up their delusional thought disorder and their psychological abuse of the child and the fact that it's a factitious disorder imposed on the child, that this is a false attachment pathology, and you are withholding that information from the court because you are from the litigant parents. That is a wrong thing to do. Okay, so they're experimenting with this quasi-judicial role and 6 to 9 months for a $20,000 assessment, rather than doing a clinical diagnostic assessment, 6 to 8 weeks, $5,000. Boom, 6 to 8 weeks, we get that back, and we can get second opinions on telehealth on that. But they're not doing that. They're withholding that from the litigant parents. They're withholding that from the courts, and giving them only the option of their forensic custody evaluations. That is highly problematic and of significant concern. Conducting experiments on human subjects, especially vulnerable populations, is concerning. So, from the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluation, 2021, an outside and independent review of forensic custody evaluations found by an 11-9 margin, a majority of the commission members favor elimination of forensic custody evaluations entirely, arguing that these reports are biased and harmful to children and lack scientific and legal value. At worst, evaluations can be dangerous, particularly in situations of domestic violence and child abuse. Now, I serve, my role is a second opinion consultant to targeted parents regarding these forensic custody evaluations. And I agree 100% with the findings of the New York Blue Ribbon Commission. From my review of forensic custody evaluations, they are dangerous, harmful to children, lack scientific and legal value, and should be entirely eliminated from the family courts as a failed experiment. We need to go back to standard healthcare diagnosis and treatment. Doctors need to remain doctors. That's what we do, diagnose and treat. We don't advise on custody. That's the court's decision. We need to get the court accurate information about the diagnosis and accurate diagnosis for the court's decision making around the child. That's our obligation as doctors, to return an accurate diagnosis. What the custody schedule is the court's consideration. So we need to end this experiment on human subjects in the family courts without proper oversight of these forensic custody and return back to established practices of healthcare. In addition, the New York Blue Ribbon Commission found or reached the conclusion that the practice is beyond reform, and that no amount of training for the courts, forensic evaluators, and or other court personnel will successfully fix the bias, inequity, and conflict of interest issues that exist within the system. Now, we, the field, the courts, professional psychology, needs to end the experiment in a quasi-judicial role for doctors and return to established healthcare practices of diagnosis and treatment. But when we do that, all the forensic psychologists who are conducting the forensic custody evaluations will have to leave the family courts along with their role. They don't know how to conduct a diagnostic assessment. They haven't been doing that. It's negligent. It's unethical, boundaries, a competence issue, variety of issues. And so we are going to be transitioning to a new approach. However, there's now a conflict of interest with the forensic psychologists who are occupying positions of influence and power, because the moment we acknowledge that their approach is a complete and total failure, then they lose their career. Okay. So forensic psychologists now are in a position where they will want to cover up their unethical practice. They're going to want to cover up the boundaries of competence issues that they're going to want to cover up the failure of their forensic quasi-judicial role in their custody evaluation approach and things. And they will want to disable the mental health system going back to clinical diagnostic assessments, because the moment it gets diagnosed as child abuse, it means they failed to diagnose child abuse throughout their entire career because they were practicing beyond the boundaries of their competence. And so they want to withhold the awareness that this is actually a delusional thought disorder, that this is actually a factitious disorder imposed on another, that this is actually child psychological abuse. They don't want people to know that, because that means they've misdiagnosed the pathology throughout their career. So the conflict of interest that was noted there by the New York Blue Ribbon Commission, and the motivation now to cover up some of the problematic, or a lot of the problematic practices that have been going on, is substantial. So, conflict of interest. There is a motivation within the forensic psychologists to cover up their failed experiment on human subjects of a quasi-judicial role for doctors. There is currently a substantial conflict of interest surrounding the judgment and decision-making of the forensic psychologists who are in positions of authority and systemic influence. The forensic psychologists are currently disabling the mental health system response, diagnosis, and treatment for their own personal, financial, and career status gain. That's a strong statement. The forensic psychologists are currently disabling the mental health system response of diagnosis and treatment for their own personal, financial, and career status gain. I'll back that up. So that's problematic. We need an active and effective mental health system, and we're not getting that from them. The forensic psychologists are ignorant. They lack knowledge and information. They're going to have to be educated about what the pathology is, how to diagnose it, and how to treat it. The forensic psychologists are indolent. They avoid activity and exertion, lazy. They just simply have not expended the effort to learn what the pathology is and to acquire the information, and so give themselves permission to just make up a new form of pathology for things they don't otherwise comprehend because they're ignorant, lack knowledge or information. And the forensic psychologists are unethical. It's violations to standards 2.01, 2.04, and 3.04 of the APA Ethics Code. Take a look at their vita, and you got examples of what attachment competence looks like and delusional thought disorder competence looks like. So take a look on their vita and see where they have that education, training, and experience in attachment pathology. If the forensic psychologist needs to be educated about the pathology, its diagnosis and treatment, then that psychologist is not competent with the pathology by a demonstrated need to be educated about it. So that's a real simple way to determine whether they're competent. Do you need to educate them about what it is? So here's my resolution. Here's what I would suggest for resolving the difference of opinion here. I propose that the AFCC host a series of public online debates, internet-mediated and moderated debates to the following questions. First, are forensic custody evaluations dangerous and harmful to children? I will take the affirmative. Yes, they are. And you can pick any one of the forensic psychologists who are encountered. Dr. Deutsch, Droids, Moran, Dr. Klein-Pruitt, Dr. Sullivan, or Dr. Ward, or Dr. Fiddler, or Dr. Saini, president of the AFCC. Any one of them, pick one, okay? And they can take the no side of that and say, no, forensic custody evaluations are not dangerous and are not harmful to children. And then we can explore the issue. They believe they're not dangerous. I believe they are. Let's have a professional level discussion about that. Because the Blue Ribbon Commission says they are, they agree with me. So let's find out. Debate. Should forensic custody evaluations be eliminated entirely from the family courts? I'll say yes. And you can find Dr. Deutsch or Droids or Moran or Klein-Pruitt or Sullivan or Ward or Fiddler or Saini can say no. We need these forensic custody evaluations in the family courts. And we can, because the New York Blue Ribbon Commission said, yes, we should get rid of them. So let's have a debate and discussion about whether that's true. Okay, so that's my recommendation. Debate. Are forensic custody evaluators practicing beyond the boundaries of their competence? I will say yes in attachment and in delusional thought disorders. Then you can get Dr. Droids or Deutsch and Moran and Klein-Pruitt and Sullivan and Ward and Fiddler and Saini. We'll pick one to take the opposite side and say that no, they are competent in the attachment system and delusional thought disorders, or they don't need to be competent in those and they can justify that position. So, but let's have a discussion about that. I'm concerned about competence issues, and so let's discuss it. Debate. Are resist-refuse dynamic and parent-child contact problems real diagnoses? Because that's their favorite thing. They're presenting on that, saying it's an advanced seminar. So you can pick any one of them for the yes, Deutsch or Droids or Dr. Moran, Klein-Pruitt, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Ward, Dr. Fiddler, Dr. Saini can say, yes, these are real things. And I will say, no, they're not. And we can explore whether or not they are real pathologies or whether or not the forensic psychologists are simply ignorant about real things. delusional thought disorder, factitious disorder imposed on another, cross-generational coalition, child psychological abuse, spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon. Debate. Are forensic custody evaluators practicing beyond the boundaries of their competence? So yes, Childress. Are forensic custody evaluations a failed experiment in service delivery to a vulnerable population? I'll say yes. They've experimented on human subjects. That's what I'll say. And it's a failed experiment. But if they say no, it's not an experiment on human subjects without proper oversight, and no, it's a successful approach, then they can argue that. And let's debate that and discuss that, because no, it's a failed experiment. And if it is a failed experiment, we need to discontinue it and get back to something that is successful, like diagnosis and treatment. Are the forensic psychologists motivated to cover up their failure and ethical violations? I will say yes. Okay, so now you can get Dr. Deutsch or Droids or Moran or Klein-Pruitt or Sullivan or Ward or Fiddler or Saini to take the contrary position and say no, they are not motivated to cover up their failure because they were successful. Maybe, I don't know. And they're not motivated to cover up their ethical violations to 2.04 and 2.01 and 3.04 because they're exempt from the ethical standards, or they meet the ethical standard, whatever it is, but they can take the contrary position. Because if they are motivated to cover up their failure, that's really problematic. And the legal professionals within the AFCC should be aware of that, so they can get a higher quality of mental health information to their legal professionals, rather than the bias and distorted information they'll be getting from the forensic psychologist for their own personal gain. Okay, so this is kind of important to kind of get an answer to. Debate. Does the practice of forensic psychology in the family courts need independent review from the APA? I will say yes, because it is this experiment that was conducted without proper oversight. It's a failed experiment. That is a rampant incompetence, and there's no standards. The licensing boards are inert and not doing anything to protect the consumers, and it's just a nightmare. So I will argue yes, we need an outside independent review. One step up from the New York Blue Ribbon Commission. We need to get this up to the APA to take an independent, neutral, eyes on what's happening in the family courts. But now you can get Dr. Deutsch or Droids or Dr. Moran or Dr. Klein-Pruitt or Dr. Sullivan or Dr. Ward or Dr. Fiddler or Dr. Saini to argue that no, it doesn't need a review from the APA because everything's fine in the family courts and there's nothing to see over here. Okay. So, but if it does, if we do need a review from the APA, then the AFCC should be asking the APA for an independent review of forensic custody evaluations in the family courts and whether there's all sorts of ethical violations to competence and those sorts of things. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my Sunday coffee talk for today. It's an interesting time in my world as I'm entering the professional world of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, the professional organization of family law professionals and legal professionals. And the legal professionals in the family courts, the attorneys, need to understand the importance of a diagnosis, because we need a diagnosis for treatment. And the attorneys need to stop asking for these forensic custody evaluations, parenting plan assessments, 6 to 9 months, $20,000, and don't return to diagnosis when we need a diagnosis. And so that's important. And then the judges or the judiciary within the family courts needs to be educated about delusional thought disorders and factitious disorders and personality disorders. And it's actually pretty simple. Okay, you can go to my website and go over all the training stuff and talk about it and how to diagnose delusion stuff. So we can get the information, and it's always the same because it's a pattern. You have a narcissistic pattern, you have a borderline pattern, and you'll see the patterns show up. And once you recognize what the patterns are, it's really easy to identify. The problem is, a forensic psychologist don't know what the patterns are, so they get all confused and they think it's all complex. No, no, no. It's all actually pretty simple once you recognize what the patterns are. Trauma is pattern. Trauma replicates pattern. So I would ask all the forensic psychologists, are you competent in complex trauma and child abuse? Because if you are, you'll know that it replicates pattern and that we're in a trauma reenactment narrative: abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent, and that's your delusional thought disorder. It's not true. There is no abusive parent, there is no protective parent, the child's not being abused. But that's the delusional thought disorder, trauma reenactment, and it's a false factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain to the narcissistic, borderline, dark personality parent. So with that, I'm going to head off to my my Sunday here, and good luck to everybody, and hopefully we can get you some competent mental health services in the family courts for the judges and for the children and for treatment. So with that, take care.